Okay, so ready to dive in. You've handed us a stack of Campari Group's financials going all the way back to 2003.
Impressive archive. Gives us a real long view, not just yearly snapshots. We can trace their whole evolution, how they went from basically a European company to, well, Campari as we know it today, a global brand.
And that's what we're after, right? Not just the what, but the how. So let's start with the foundation, the financials themselves. One thing that jumps out, their revenue growth is huge. Early 2000s, we're talking around 600 million euros, but fast forward to 2023, over 2.8 billion.
That's a lot of Aperol spritzes. But you're right to highlight that growth. It's not a straight lineup, though. There are these jumps, especially mid-2000s and again recently.
So what's happening during those times? Is it just the world suddenly craving more Campari?
Not quite. Those periods coincide with some major strategic moves, especially acquisitions. They bring new brands into the fold, and boom, revenue reflects that.
Speaking of which, I found something interesting in the 2003 report. Back then, their fourth largest brand by value, I wasn't even theirs.
Mhm.
1800 tequila, they were distributing it in the US.
Yeah. Shows how Campari was already thinking strategically about partnerships, leveraging their distribution network even back then, finding those growth opportunities even outside their core brands.
And that seems to shift, right? They go from boosting others' brands to snagging big names for themselves. Grand Marnier, in 2016, their report that year, they were practically giddy about it. And looking at 2023, Grand Marnier is a real cornerstone of their global portfolio.
Acquisitions are key to understanding their growth. Absolutely. But it's not just buying any brand, there's a method. They call it premiumization. In the reports, basically, they're betting that people, well, people like us, are willing to pay a bit more for higher quality.
So it's not just competing on price, it's moving into this whole other space brand history, the story, the experience, a higher price tag, but it's tied to something.
Exactly. And this isn't a recent thing either. You can see this forming even back in the mid-2000s. That's when their global reach really takes off, too. 2003, they're in around 160 markets. By 2023, almost to 190.
Global domination, almost. But it's fascinating. These reports aren't just numbers, there's a whole story. We're seeing a company carefully crafting its image, going global, aiming for that top shelf, the aspirational.
Mhm.
But it's not just buying up brands, is it? What about growing their own? Like Aperol that feels like it went from niche Italian drink to everyone and their cousins sipping it practically overnight.
You're right, and the reports actually give some clues how they pulled that off. That 2016 report we mentioned, they highlight Aperol as a key driver of organic growth, meaning not just from acquisitions. They were targeting key markets, especially Europe and North America, specific campaigns.
This was when Aperol spritzes started trending, right? So they saw the wave coming and rode it.
More like they saw the wave and grabbed a surfboard. Their proactive approach, it worked. It's a classic example of good brand building. They identified a product with wide appeal, tapped into emerging trends, targeted their marketing, and bam, the financials show the results.
Which is a good reminder, right? These numbers, they're not just abstract. They're real decisions, campaigns, people influencing what we're drinking.
And speaking of people, one thing that struck me going through this, the way they talk about their employees, you wouldn't always expect that from a global spirits company, this almost heart on their sleeve thing.
I'll admit, the level of detail about employee well-being was surprising. It's not just a sentence, it's a whole section, especially in the last decade's reports. They even have this Campari Foundation. Admit it, did you know about this? Started back in '57, originally to support Italian employees, but they've gone global with it. And it's not just office perks. We're talking housing assistance, scholarships for employees' kids.
Yeah.
The works.
That level of investment, it's unusual to say the least. And it does seem to be more than just good PR. They consistently highlight their high employee satisfaction scores, engagement. It suggests this commitment to their people. It's baked into the culture.
Even have lunches with Bob's.
Yeah.
Employees get to have lunch with the CEO, Bob Kunze-Concewitz.
Yeah.
And from what they say in the reports, it's not just about profit margins. It's part of this whole open communication thing, feedback from all levels.
Speaks to a leadership style that values transparency, employee input. It's not often you see this level of detail about internal stuff in financial reports. Definitely piqued my interest.
And it seems to be working. They consistently meet their target for voluntary turnover, meaning people want to stick around. Which, let's be honest, not always the case, especially with big corporations. But before we get too caught up in the feel-good stuff, we got to talk about the R-word, risk. Even with this track record, no company's immune.
Exactly. They're global. They're selling a product that's subject to changing tastes, regulations. There are going to be bumps in the road. And they actually address that quite directly, even in their earlier reports.
As early as 2007, they're already talking about the impact of legislation on the drinks industry. They saw the growing concern about alcohol, especially among young people, and what it could mean for business.
And it wasn't just theoretical either. Remember the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Their 2023 report, they dedicate a whole analysis to how they're navigating that, the geopolitical uncertainty.
And what struck me, they were upfront about it not significantly impacting their overall results. That speaks to their global strategy, right?
Yeah.
Russia and Ukraine were a small part of their sales, but the growth elsewhere, which we see steadily increasing in the reports,
Yeah.
and more than made up for it.
It's like they built this diversified portfolio of brands, of markets, almost like a risk mitigation strategy in itself. They're prepared, whatever the world throws at them. But speaking of portfolios, I think we've covered a lot of ground on this first round.
A toast to that. But with Campari, not water, obviously. We'll be back soon to dig into more of these intriguing insights. Don't go anywhere. Back for another round. I'm ready to stir things up some more. How about you? Got more Campari goodness from these reports.
Indeed. This next batch, it gets into how Campari's building for the long haul. And honestly, some of it might surprise you how they're future-proofing the business.
Well, I love a good surprise, so
Right.
lay it on me. What stood out to you about their long-term vision?
One word, strategy. It jumps out at you reading these reports one after the other. They're not just reacting to the market, they're shaping it. Playing chess, not checkers.
Okay, I like that. So how does that play out in their actual decisions?
Look at their acquisitions, for example. Take La Salle de Mercado back in 2012. This wasn't just, oh, another brand for the collection. It was about Jamaica, the Caribbean rum market they were securing a foothold.
Ah, they were thinking ahead,
Oh.
anticipating that rum boom, everyone suddenly wanting fancy mojitos.
Exactly. They were ahead of the curve. And it all ties back to that premiumization we talked about. They're not just after mass appeal. They want the good stuff, the top shelf. Building a portfolio that reflects that.
It's like they're selling a lifestyle, an
Mhm.
aspiration.
Right.
Not just the drink itself, but the whole experience.
Precisely. And the reports get into how they do that. They talk about brand building, innovation, really interesting stuff, actually.
Okay, give me an example. What kind of innovation are we talking about?
In the 2019 and 2021 reports, they mentioned this thing called the learning distillery. At first, I thought, oh, cool, they're experimenting with new flavors, like a test kitchen for cocktails.
Which, side note, we should pitch to them. A Campari test kitchen. Just saying.
Right. But it turns out Learning Distillery is something even more interesting. It's their internal training platform for employees. And not just your typical corporate training, they're talking about fostering a real culture of learning, knowledge sharing.
So investing in their people as much as their brands.
Exactly. You hit it on the head. And that comes up again and again as you read. The Learning Distillery is just one example. This dedication to employee development, it's impressive. And it seems to be paying off. Look at their retention rates. But it's not just about keeping employees happy. It's about that long-term view again.
Creating a sustainable business from the inside out.
Now you're getting it. And that philosophy, it goes beyond just how they treat their employees. It shows up in their approach to sustainability, too, especially in the more recent reports.
Oh yeah, their sustainability section, that was impressive. And I mean, it was really detailed, not just a quick paragraph like, we care about the planet, buy our booze.
Great. They're weaving it into everything. Their 2023 report is a great example. They lay out all these ambitious goals, reducing carbon emissions, water consumption, responsible sourcing. They're not messing around.
I was really struck by that glass recycling project. They talk about the one in Italy.
Yes. Trying to create a closed-loop system for their glass production.
Mm-hmm.
Not only is it good for the planet, it makes business sense, too. Less waste, lower costs in the long run. It's smart.
It's really refreshing to see a company, especially in an industry that sometimes gets a bad rap for its environmental impact, taking it this seriously. But their idea of sustainability, it goes beyond just the planet, right?
Absolutely. They talk a lot about responsible drinking, too, addressing the social side of things, working with organizations to promote responsible habits, combating alcohol abuse.
It's like they're acknowledging, hey, we make alcohol as part of our responsibility to make sure it's consumed responsibly.
Exactly. They're taking a holistic approach, supporting local communities, promoting diversity within the company, fair labor practices. It's all connected for them.
And they're very upfront about the challenges, too. Like, they don't shy away from talking about the potential impact of climate change on their supply chain. That caught my eye. They're not pretending it's not a thing.
That's what I mean about their transparency. It builds trust, you know? They're not just here to celebrate the wins, they're acknowledging the complexities. And that goes for their financials, too. Even when the numbers weren't stellar, they explain why, clearly and honestly.
It's like they're saying, we're not perfect, but we're learning. We're in this for the long haul. Which I think is a good lesson for all of us, right? Whether we're talking about global corporations or just our own lives. It's about constantly evolving, being open to new information, and trying to do better.
Well said. And Campari Group, they're a company to watch, not just for their bottom line, but for their willingness to push boundaries, to redefine what success looks like in the 21st century.
Back for one last sip. After that deep dive, I'm ready to raise a glass to Campari Group. How about you?
Absolutely. Though after all this, I'm feeling more like a thoughtfully chosen vintage, something with a bit of complexity, like what we've uncovered here.
Love it. Okay, so we've journeyed through 2 decades of Campari Group. If we had to distill it down, what are the big takeaways, the things that really stand out?
Well, their growth is incredible. They went from mainly European to a global spirits powerhouse, and they did it through smart acquisitions and some seriously savvy brand building.
And it's not just that they grew, it's how. Like you said, they were strategic. This
Yeah.
premiumization thing, they were onto that long before it was a buzzword.
Right. They had their finger on the pulse, knew what consumers would want, sometimes even before we knew it ourselves. And you can't forget their focus on employees. A lot of companies talk a big game about CSR, but with Campari, it's not just lip service. You see it in the financials year after year. That Campari Foundation, the lunches with the CEO, it's part of their DNA.
And it seems to work. I mean, their employee retention speaks for itself. They're doing something right. And then, of course, the sustainability piece. That's really taken center stage in their more recent reports, hasn't it?
It has, and it's very thorough. They're not just trying to check a box. Their efforts to be environmentally responsible, from how they source ingredients to their actual production processes, it shows they get it. A sustainable business is good business, full stop.
Yeah, they're playing the long game for sure. They're thinking about the future, and not just their own. But they're also realistic, they're not sugarcoating things. They acknowledge the risks in their industry head on in these reports, whether it's regulations changing, global instability, even just what if people's tastes change?
And they address it all. That's the transparency we've been talking about. It matters. Investors, stakeholders, everyone sees that, and it builds trust. Because let's face it, the world's a complicated place, and they're not shying away from that.
It's refreshing, honestly. It's like they're saying, we don't have all the answers, but we're asking the right questions. Which I think is a great place to leave things with you, our listener. We've unpacked Campari's past, their present, using their own words. But the future, well, that's still being written.
And that's the exciting part, isn't it? We've seen how adaptable they are, how they've navigated the last couple of decades. Now the question is, what challenges and opportunities will the next 20 years bring? Will they stay ahead of the curve, predict what we'll be drinking before we even know it?
Will their focus on sustainability become even more central to their identity? How will they impact an industry that's grappling with its own footprint on the world? So much to consider.
Exactly. And that's the beauty of a deep dive like this. It sparks more questions. It gets you thinking, not just about one company, but about the bigger picture, the choices we make, the things we value. It all adds up.
Well said. So next time you're sipping on a Campari, whatever your drink of choice may be, take a moment to appreciate it all, the strategy, the vision, even just a dash of serendipity that goes into building a brand, a business, a legacy. Cheers to that. And until next time, happy exploring. We'll see you in the next deep dive.